Many thanks to viewer Chainsaw Panda 2 for suggesting that a video be made about the difference World War II made on Canada, comparing the beginning to the end of the war. On September 10, 1939, Canada independently declared war on Germany. Canada had not yet emerged from the effects of the Great Depression. There were more than 1 million people on social assistance and 400,000 workers were unemployed. There were virtually no armament works, no production of large ships and large planes, no gun and tank production. Here is the interesting growth of Canada's military industrial might during the war. Different sources disagree on the numbers somewhat, but these are a close historical representation. Canada had about 11.3 million people at the beginning of the war. This graph shows that, if you discount children under 14, Canada started out with 8.3 million people and grew through natural increase to 8.9 million by the end of the war. Canada's total armed forces at about a month after the war had started, including the Navy and the Air Force, was a paltry 70,000 men and women. By May 8, 1945, which was Victory in Europe Day, the day Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allies, Canada's armed forces had ramped up to over 751,000 men and women serving in the war effort, which represents 8.4% of the over 14 population. At the end of 1944, Canada's male population, aged 18 to 45, totaled 2,474,000. 36,000 women served in the armed forces by 1944. If we take the figure serving from late 1944 and subtract the women, the total number of males serving was about 723,879. This means that almost one-third, about 29% of all Canadian males from the ages of 18 to 45 served in uniform in World War II. When we review the growth of the Canadian Army, we see it went from just over 63,000 to almost 500,000, which is about 7.8 times the original number. The Royal Canadian Navy also grew by 18.5 times, from 5,116 to about 95,000 personnel by 1945. The Royal Canadian Air Force also grew by 20.3 times its original amount. However, as we can see, its peak was late in 1943, and there was a drawdown of the RCAF before the war was entirely over. This was likely due to casualties, the lack of bombing targets in Germany, and a shifting of war priorities near the end of the conflict. When we look at the military-industrial base, we see that the war industry started out with minimal, almost nothing, and later became, by the end of 1945, the fourth largest Allied producer. In aircraft production, it's almost nothing, but later on it's 16,000 per year. With military vehicles, it started out with a small civilian industry, but later at the end of the war, 1945, it's 800,000 vehicles per year. Tanks and armored vehicles, again, almost none, but later it's 45,000 to 50,000 a year. Guns was limited, and later it's 40,000. And same thing with merchant ships and escort ships and factory workforce. The factory workforce went from depression levels to 900,000 plus workers, which was an astounding recovery. The Canadian Army's total casualties in all categories were 74,374, of which 22,964 were fatal. For all three services, fatal casualties numbered 41,992, or 3.86% of the total enlisted. The Air Force had 17,047 fatal casualties, a particularly heavy proportion. None of the casualty figures include prisoners of war who were later repatriated, which in the case of the Army included 6,432 personnel of all ranks.